Taking a breath in. We breathe in peace, we exhale love. So today's tenet is tenet 8 from Living Peace, release knowing, and the arts associated with it are the art of humility and the arts of vulnerability, which as we go throughout today's sermon, you're going to learn more and more about how those incorporate into our ability to release knowing. And the question for those of you who have pens or pamphlets or whatever you want to write down on, or you could just put it in your mind and you could watch the video back later. Do any of my opinions about life close me off from others? Do any of my opinions about life close me off from others? Let's breathe that in for a moment and just sit with that. Do any of my opinions about life close me off from others? And with that, we can even change life. Do any opinions about my husband or my wife or my kids or my family or my community or the world or political groups or religious groups? You literally could put anyone in this. My colleagues at work, my boss, my peers. It could be anything and everyone. What are the opinions I hold and how is it closing me off? Because something very important to understand is the correlation between belief and behavior. Belief and behavior, write those two things next to each other. Belief and behavior. Depending on your beliefs, it is going to completely change the way in which you show up in the world and how you're relating to others, how you're interacting with others, the things you say, the actions you take, and the decisions you make. All of it stems from mind. Interesting, isn't it? We hear the saying, some of you may have heard this before, thought is the building block of reality. Thought is the building block of reality. And when you just say that, it doesn't really help anyone. Like, okay, but still, I'm still going to be, caught up in my beliefs and whatnot. And we don't really associate or understand just how much when we understand the psychology of what's going on behind our abuse, our wounds, or the abuse that we're causing other people and our addictions and literally anything that we're suffering from. This is what Buddhism teaches. Anything that we're suffering from has some root in the understanding of the neurosis of the mind, or AKA also known as Mr. Ego or Mrs. Ego. It doesn't need to be gender-based. Just say ego, damn it. Why'd I go there? But really think about that. Really think about all the ways in which we're defending ourselves from all the things that make us uncomfortable. And we can have compassion for that. Because I guarantee that any of the opinions that you have towards other people or the world, a lot of it most likely stems from some form of defense mechanism. Because it's something that makes you uncomfortable. Who's been in a relationship before and skirted around difficult conversations because it was uncomfortable? Right?
Never.
It's uncomfortable. And so we don't go there because it makes us feel vulnerable. It makes us feel vulnerable. It may even make us feel weak. It may trigger our own insecurity or abandonment issues or just anything that we've been taught growing up. And here's a really important thing. No matter what religion, politics, culture, whatever the hell you were brought up in, it's just an idea. That's it. It's an idea that a group of people agreed upon. And if you were born anywhere else in the world, you'd have that idea. Isn't that interesting? But we don't think that way, do we? We're brought up in a culture, or religion, or a political group, and then we think this must be right because we're surrounded by those reinforcing beliefs. And I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. I really don't give a shit. What I care about is there's pain and there's peace. And are my beliefs and are my actions leading to peace, or are my actions and my beliefs leading to division, and they're leading to me closing myself off from my loved ones or other people, causing me suffering, causing other people suffering? It's interesting, isn't it? And a lot of us have a lot of preconceived notions about other people that we've never even met. As a gay Buddhist cowboy, believe you me, people have a lot of preconceived notions about me. And it really triggers them. And that's okay. But I guarantee if any of those people actually sat down with the conversation, they'd realize there's no threat there. And I would actually be really invested in what they have to say, and I would not judge them for their own beliefs. And we'd build bridges. I would always, in high school, I would always befriend the guys that would call me faggot. They just didn't know who I was. They didn't understand. and they had these preconceived notions of what it meant that I was gay. And it was just this really fascinating thing that through compassionate communication and listening, I was able to bridge that gap. And I wasn't offended, because does it make sense to be offended by someone else's not knowing? When other people when they say these harsh things against you or any of us or against each other, it really just stems from ignorance. The fourth tenet, ignorance is an illusion, we seek understanding. And ignorance is not a mean word. It literally just means not knowing. Just not knowing. But then when you meet someone that is different than you and you have that conversation, all of a sudden you start to know a little bit more. You start to develop a greater understanding, and it's this really beautiful thing that builds bridges. And that's why I always get cracked up when people call us a cult. I thought of that today. I'm like, it doesn't happen that often, but every now and then, someone will use the C word. And I'm like, well, what's interesting about cults is that they're often very limiting in their perceptions, and they try and limit your worldview. And what we're teaching here, even in these robes that seem weird, what we're teaching here is to get really intimate with the world. Get into those uncomfortable moments with other people that are very different from you. It doesn't matter what walk of life you're in, try and really release your opinion and show up for other people, no matter what their politics are, what their religious beliefs are, what their culture is, and go there with them and really see what happens then. Build those bridges of communication. This is not a tradition of limitation. Sure, we might be limiting our own self-discipline behaviors of not freaking out at people. We might be limiting our judgments. We might be limiting our addictive tendencies. And that's all still personal choice. There's no judgment if you don't choose to, because in limitation can come powerful structure for self-healing. Think of Steve Jobs, how they just focused on just a couple products to make them the best possible, and how he actually took from Taoist and Zen philosophies of living very minimalistically. He'd wear the same shirt every single day, because the less time you have to worry about what you're wearing, the more time you can actually give to other people or your projects. Isn't that interesting? So that's why I would love to just wear a robe all the time, not even have to worry about shopping for clothes or what I'm going to figure out or wear that day. And then you shave your head, you go full monkhood. You don't have to worry about your hair. It saves you a lot of time. And if you only have a couple meals a day, you have the same meal every day, it saves a lot of time. Again, people don't find that as joyous. But that's why monastics do it. When you take away the attachment to the physicality, you can be of selfless service more to others. But going back to that C word, really think about that for a moment, and how this is actually a tradition of great expansion and making sure that we are showing up for other people, putting even our own beliefs to the side and showing up for other people and fully hearing them. So I have 3 little nuggets for you. I call them the How to Love 3. One day it'll be more of a eloquent, poetic title. But the How to Love 3. And the first one is active listening. Pretty straightforward. But how often do we do that? Straightforward, but not that easy to put into effect, because when our ego's triggered, the last thing we want to do is listen. Or maybe we're listening and nodding, but we're biting our tongue and we're not even hearing what the other word the person is saying. We're just like, and just waiting for them to leave. And then you go and call your girlfriend or guy friend a bitch. I'm sorry, that's rude. You gossip. It's true. We potentially have all done it to some extent or another. And if not, I'm sure it's manifested in other ways. Or we just harbor it within and we develop our own judgment and resentment. And so we have active listening, and then the second one is gentle curiosity. We talked about this last Wednesday night during our Zen gathering. Gentle curiosity. Rather than feeling, when we feel that discomfort with another person, rather than instantly feeling, oh, I need to separate or shut this down, get curious about it. Lean into it. Pema Chodron talks a lot about this. Leaning into the uncomfortableness of the situation, leaning into the groundlessness of the situation. So when you combine gentle curiosity with active listening, you're going to ask really powerful questions, and it's going to lead to some really revealing insights that will help bridge that gap. And the third one is compassionate sight. compassionate sight. And what that means is that we proactively work on starting our day off with the eyes of compassion, so that any person we meet along our journey each and every day, we're softening our gaze. And so I like that word, softening the gaze, because what that does is it's softening our perception. So anytime you have a judgment, it's hard, it's harsh. So you want to soften that, you want to soothe that. And so we do that with the compassionate sight. And then when you combine active listening with gentle curiosity and compassionate sight, something miraculous happens. Love happens. And it could be with a stranger. You're holding a loving space, a loving environment, a loving embodiment when you're engaging in someone else, even if they're triggering your ego. Because you can override that ego, you can override your judgments. And our goal in this tradition, in Living Peace and Duna Show, or even just for those of you who just show up on Sundays and enjoy it and take it to your home, like all this stuff can really help your own home life and your family life and anyone you have to interact with. You don't have to go on full monk. You know, I have 10 years of coaching, life coaching with people, and a lot of it has been with couples and relationships and family dynamics, especially teenagers. And a lot of teenagers, it stems from not being understood by their family or not being understood by their teachers or their peers, because a lot of times we don't really teach people fully how to listen, how to have gentle curiosity, how to have compassionate sight. And the divorce rate seems to continue increasing. I haven't seen the statistics lately, but it's it's up there. And a lot of it stems from, if you actually look at all the issues in a relationship, it always goes back to couples not being able to hear one another. It goes from in that pain and that spilling over of that pain. And maybe you did tie the knot a little too soon. It was never really a meant to be type of relationship, but it doesn't have to blow up. Because often when we feel triggered in our ego, what happens? We go to the addiction, we go to the shutting down, or we go to the explosion, or we go to the blaming, we go to the projection. There's all these fun psychological things that occur anytime we feel threatened and we feel triggered. And then who's ever like compromised out of wanting love? That happens too. We'll compromise ourselves, our own peace, just because we want some kind of connection with another being. And guess what happens when you do that? Do you actually feel heard? Do you actually feel seen? Do you actually feel acknowledged in those situations? Often not. Because really think about that for a moment. How many of you were actually raised with these teachings on how to love, on how to actively listen, how to actively have compassionate sight, and how to actively have gentle curiosity? Hell, I wasn't even. I teach this to my parents now. We can all use a little tweakage. Because when the ego takes over, when we feel that threatened moment, we feel that trigger, we lose ourselves, either momentarily or for a week or for a month or for a year, for a few decades, Let's breathe that in. So when we can humble ourselves, when we can have humility, even when it's in a difficult situation that makes us feel threatened and we feel like the other person's not understanding us and they're insulting us or they're saying these mean things, if we actually sink into these three teachings right here in the collective of release knowing, it will actually soften what's happening. The opposite occurs normally, because when you're not feeling understood and someone's being mean to you, what do you often do? You get defensive or aggressive. So you might shut down and walk away, and then it doesn't resolve that way. Or you lash back. And then it escalates. And then the things are said even worse. And then you have to go on that healing journey. The situation wasn't even about, what ends up happening is there's one situation that you're arguing about, right? But then you freak out on each other. And now you have to heal that karma that was just created between you two. And then you go on that cycle, and it seems to just escalate. So you just go into that complete train crash, and then you separate completely, and no learning has been had. And then 10 years later, you go to therapy, and you're just like, I have some healing here. And then you start over. Not saying that's your story, but it's a lot of people's stories out there. So my call to action. Do any of my opinions about life close me off from others? Do any of my opinions about my family close me off from my family? Do any of my opinions about my spouse or my kids close me off from them? Am I fully practicing active listening, or once someone tells me something, am I actively trying to fix it so I'm not even hearing them? Spouses do that to each other, and especially parents do that to their kids. They express a problem, they just want to be heard and acknowledged, and instead, in their misperceived love, the spouse or the parent instantly goes into fixing mode. And then the spouse or the child says, that's not what I'm looking for right now. And they're just like, I'm just trying to help you. And then it turns into this weird little fight. And no one feels heard or seen or appreciated. When in actuality, what was always present there was love, was connection, but it was just being misinterpreted because we don't fully know how to listen. We don't fully know how to have gentle curiosity, and we don't know how to especially not take other people's problems on as our own. When your child is suffering, it does not give you permission to suffer with them. Write that down. That's some powerful shit. When your child is suffering, it does not give you permission to suffer with them. And when your spouse is suffering or your friend is suffering, it does not give you permission to suffer with them. And that's often what we do. And now you just have two people suffering.
But isn't it interesting that the other person wants you to suffer with them?
They do.
To not feel so alone.
To not feel so alone. And so often we match that, don't we? We sink down into that vibration because misery loves company, and we match it. But what would happen if we actually held that torch of peace? One, they may not talk to us as much. but when they're ready, they now have someone to talk to about realignment with peace. But when you're always matching them, then no one's holding that torch of peace. And often it actually triggers our own ego even more. We get caught up in that ego even more. And so most of us are, it's almost like, who feels like that? Like there's always like different shit, different day. Different shit, different day, or different shit, different week. And it just keeps escalating and going and going. It's because no one is holding the torch of peace. Because we're always matching each other's drama. You know, I can attest my ego when I have some, I don't do this anymore, but back in the day when I have some drama that like happened, you want to call the friend that's going to react with you. You don't want to call the friend that's just going to be like, let's breathe into that for a moment. But if we start to learn, if more people are living this and more people start to say, let's breathe into that for a moment, we get less validation for us acting in our hecticness. And when we're less validated in it, we ground quicker. Ooh, breathe that in. Let me see real quick. I'm working on being more cognizant of the time, more aware of the time. Last week's sermon went a bit long. So let me see if there's other points. So long story short, when we're actively doing these things that we're talking about today, when we're actively listening, gentle curiosity and love and compassionate sight, we're actually able to see the root of suffering. One conversation with this with a loved one in your life, you will learn more about that loved one than you have in 10 years if you have not been actively doing these teachings. One conversation, 1 hour conversation of doing these 3 teachings with a loved one, you will likely learn more about your loved one in that 1 hour than you have for 10 years of not applying this. I've seen it happen again and again and again, and you will really learn and hear why your partner or why your child is suffering and where the pain is, where the feeling of detachment or the disconnect comes from. And then when you actually hear it, you can actually work on healing it. We can start to soothe the suffering. And it's interesting. I see it repeatedly in individuals' lives where I generally don't have couples in the same room right now anymore that are really working on their stuff because it's so easy to get triggered. But then individually, what's interesting is you hear their stories and you hear exactly what they want their partner to feel and hear and see and acknowledge in the relationship. And sometimes it may not even be that big of a thing, but the partner already has an idea of who their partner is. And so when that conversation occurs, they're only seeing their partner through their own lens, their own biased perception. And so even if you have them in a counseling room and you're trying to hold space for them, it doesn't always hit because they have to be the ones that are open to it. And so that's why we teach couples, we teach families, we teach children, we teach everyone this to individually learn how to do this. So the next time you go into that relationship, as long as one person is holding that torch of peace, a bridge can start to be built. It may not happen overnight, but it starts to be built. Does that make sense? Breathe that deliciousness in. So let's go ahead and read the little quotes in the handout real quick, and we'll conclude with that. So this is from page 154 in Living Peace. Vulnerability means being strong and secure enough in yourself that you can walk outside without your armor on. You're able to fully show up in life no matter the situation and just be you. Living with the openness and tenderness of vulnerability takes genuine strength and courage. Armor may look tough, but all it does is mask insecurity and fear. And then page 156. The more our ego puffs us up with the illusion of knowing, the less we're able to learn. It's hard to fill a cup that is supposedly already full. We must always remember that it is the consistency of our practice that maintains our vibrational reality of peace, not the achievement of learning or knowing. Enlightenment is about being, not knowing. To be is to do. To be is to do. I didn't go in this direction today, but another way we can take release knowing is how you're learning these studies for so long as a student, and then you get to this point of being like, well, I know something. And instantly that closes off further learning because you're now attached to an idea of knowing rather than keeping yourself open each and every single day. If we're not actively doing what we've learned and still causing dramas and messes for ourselves, then we can be assured that we do not know. For if we did, we wouldn't be recreating and reinforcing old patterns of pain. So all you have to do is look at your life. Look at how you might be separating from other people. Look at how there might be still drama in it. If there is, then you're not getting the nail on the head yet. And that's okay. But be humble with it. Have that humility. Because again, because it's uncomfortable, we often say, well, I know that already. Well, if you knew that already, then you'd be doing it, because when you really know it, so to speak, you would never choose the alternative because you realize how silly it is to go back to that pain, to go back to that addiction, to go back to whatever it is. Does that make sense? And that's one of the hardest things to really accept and look at. And to say, maybe I've studied this for 20 years, but there's still that hectic energy. And so maybe I am ready to go back to being that student again, which even as masters, we're always maintaining that student mindfulness, because what creates enlightenment is not achievement, it is doing the work each and every single day. That is what allows us to actually be the embodiment of peace. Deep breath. Thank you, thank you, thank you. One more breath. Shifting gears. Hello, YouTubers. Any information for additional information, eventually I'll be setting up a Patreon page. You can visit our website for one-on-one sessions or other videos. All those links are in the description down below. And then also any donations that you'd like to make. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We'll see you next week.